A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. If you need a website or a domain, go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase. Hello everybody, hope you're all well. Welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me again. Today's video is a little bit different. Basically, a couple of weeks ago, I sent out a newsletter where I asked people to submit some photos of their camera gear with a list of what it was that I was looking at in case I couldn't quite tell from the photos. And the initial plan was basically to go through those photos in a video and basically just be nosy, looking at other people's camera gear, talking about it, working out what I liked, didn't like. The problem is that I only expected about a dozen entries because it's a bit of a faff taking photos of all your camera gear. But I got hundreds of photos of people's kit. And I didn't really know what to do because it would take hours to go through all of that stuff. And I didn't think that would make a particularly compelling video, but I didn't want to waste the effort that people have gone to send me a photo and the list of their kit. So what I've done is I've sort of amalgamated all of those photos and lists into what hopefully is quite an interesting set of data. And I've never said interesting set of data before, I don't think, but we'll see. I mean, it is interesting. I've already done it. It is interesting, but that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. What you're using to shoot, then that's just it, actually, yeah. What you're using to shoot. There's nothing else. Before we do that, though, a very quick plug for myself. My book, Human Nature, which I've been banging on about for about 4 or 5 years now, is finally ready for pre-order. Now, if you're new to this channel, Human Nature is a title I'm very proud of, but B, it's a study of basically man-made things, including humans, and their relationship with nature and the landscapes that they sit within. And essentially, it's my best career work to date. Most of the 120 odd photos that feature in the book have been taken in the last 5 years or so, and I thought this book would be ready about 4 or 5 years ago. But every time I went on a trip and got 1 or 2 photos that I thought would be perfect for the book, I ended up thinking, well, maybe that will happen on the next trip as well. And so here we are in 2024. But I do think the book is all the better for it, and I'm incredibly proud of it, and I can't wait to see it. It'll be printed in the next few weeks. I will receive the book in late September, I think, and then they'll be distributed immediately. So if you pre-order one, you will get it in time for Christmas. And if you order by the 1st of August, your name will appear in the book as a thank you for pre-ordering and supporting the project so early on. And if you're buying as a gift, then just include the recipient's name at the top of the delivery address so that I know which name to include in the book. But yeah, very excited. Can't wait to get it. And if you pre-order now, it'll be of huge help because the bill from the printers is more than the amount of money I put down to buy my house. So quite scary. Anyway, need some oil. That's enough of a plug. Let's talk about this data. Camera brands that people are using. This, I think, is interesting. Now, the first thing that we should look at, I think, is the MPB research that was done last year on the used camera market. Now, the used camera market, I think, is much more representative of what people are choosing to buy and shoot with, because an awful lot of people are buying cameras that aren't new cameras that aren't being sold on the new market at the moment. So looking at the used market, I think gives an accurate reflection of what it is that people are buying. And what you can see are a couple of trends. Firstly, Canon and Nikon users are declining quite steeply, and Sony, Fujifilm, and other users are increasing quite steadily too. Now, I don't know enough about the camera industry to really understand why that is. I don't know if it's the fault of Canon and Nikon for not getting into mirrorless soon enough or not producing compelling enough products, or it's just the fact that there are lots of companies now producing fantastic cameras. I don't really know, but it's interesting to see how this compares to the data that I've collected. Now, the differences in my data set, I think, can be explained, at least in part, by a phenomenon that I've only really become aware of in the past few years, which is that lots of people choose the photography channels they watch based on the gear that the photographer is using. Now, on one level, that kind of makes sense. If people are talking about particular cameras, it makes sense that you would want to watch those videos if they're talking about the camera that you use. But it's even applicable to channels like mine where, I'm not talking every week about Sony settings and how I set up my Sony camera, for instance. Yet, lots of people will watch my channel in large part because I'm using Sony cameras. I know it's the same for Nigel, for instance, with Nikon users, and it's the same for lots of people, regardless of how much you're actually talking about that camera, which I think in part explains the reason that the Sony share is bigger than the share in the MPB research. I also think that explains a relatively big Lumix share because I shot Lumix exclusively for a few years. That might explain a slightly lower share from Canon, although it's still 21% of people, despite the fact I've never shot Canon on this channel before. It might explain why Fuji is on the low end at 6%. And on Fuji, actually, I've got to say, I expected to see a lot of X100s, and there definitely were a few, but nowhere near as many as I thought there would be, given that the new one is like sold out for months on end. Maybe that's it, maybe people are still waiting for theirs. But not as many as I thought there would be. And in fact, Fuji and Leica are about the same level of popularity in my audience, apparently. Not far behind them are Ricoh, Mamiya, Minolta and Hasselblad. Many of those cameras film cameras, and we'll get onto that, but that is also true of Nikon and Olympus. A lot of the Nikon and Olympus cameras that I saw were also film cameras, which I think is quite interesting. So that's brands. Mouse isn't working. Change those batteries. Sensor size. Now, obviously, I only included digital cameras in the sensor size data, but it's probably no shock to learn that about 80% of people are shooting either full frame or APS-C. Micro Four Thirds I expected to be a bit more. That's about 11%. And then there's just over 4% for medium format, and then there's just over 4% for other as well. So other is like 1-inch sensors from point and shoots, phones. Lots of people included photos of their phones for good reason. Oh, delivery. Looks like Emily's bought a smokeless fire pit. We'll see how smokeless it is. Yeah, sensor size, that's about all there is to say, I think. Why is this mouse still not working? Next up, number of cameras. Now, it's no surprise, I don't think, to see that most people, just 52%, had one camera. For the most part, this is a hobby for people, and therefore you don't need countless cameras around. One camera makes a lot of sense. Nearly 80% of people, nearly 80, had one or two cameras. And I've got to say that from the photos I saw, the vast majority of second cameras are very definitely second cameras. So I didn't see many setups where, for example, people had a Sony A7 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, but then a second one as their second camera. So basically a mirrored body, as you'd expect lots of professionals to have. And so in more cases than not, the second camera looked to me to be an older camera. Perhaps it was their previous first camera that they just decided not to sell. 4.3% of people are very lucky and have more than 5 cameras. Yeah, and we'll get on to talk about what kinds of cameras those look like. But yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. Now, this I thought was very interesting, this next one. Film cameras make up more than a quarter of the cameras that people sent photos of. Now, it's quite difficult, because I didn't ask people, to work out if this is a result of the recent resurgence of film, or whether for the most part these are cameras that people have had for decades. I suspect it's a bit of both, based on what I saw in the photos. But either way, this is a huge proportion of cameras that are film cameras, much more than I expected. There might be a couple of reasons for it. A, the people most likely to bother sending me a photo of their kit perhaps are people that are quite proud of their kits. People that are quite proud of their kits are people who have kind of different, eccentric, interesting, historical kits, and therefore maybe more of those people are film photographers or people who shoot with film cameras every now and then. But the second thing to say about this that became clear as I looked at more and more photos was that this number of film cameras doesn't necessarily represent the number of film photographers, because in many cases, people who had one film camera also had other film cameras. In other words, it's very likely that if someone shoots film, they do so with more than one camera. I hope that makes sense. That said, of all the people that submitted answers, the vast majority, 80% of those people, only shoot with either digital or film. Only 20% of people, less than 20% of people in fact, use both. How many lenses do people have? Now, I wish I'd counted this differently, to be honest. I wish I'd only included the lenses that are clearly in somebody's primary kit. There were many instances where people had loads and loads of lenses across multiple kits, and I've included those, which I'm not sure is massively helpful, because other than finding out how many lenses people own, you don't really learn a lot. I think it'd be more interesting to know how many lenses people use. But nevertheless, even though I've done this a bit stupidly, 2/3 of people have 1 to 3 lenses, which I think makes a lot of sense. And anecdotally, I've noticed over the past couple of years, and perhaps this is a result of me doing this, I've noticed that lots of people are telling me that they are slimming down their kits. They're carrying less stuff, they're using less lenses, they're using smaller lenses. That is definitely a trend that I'm noticing. As I say, it might just be because I'm doing that and therefore people are more likely to tell me that that's what they're also doing. But on workshops, emails that I get, comments I see, that definitely seems to be a trend. So yeah. That said, 8.9% of people have more than 6 lenses. Now, types of lenses. I thought this was quite interesting. 60% of the lenses in the photos were primes. Just over 40% were zooms. Now, I've got to say, I don't think this necessarily means that most people are shooting primes. I think it's probably close, maybe 50-50 based on the photos that I saw. But I think what's happening here is a couple of things. Number one, most of the film setups that I saw were using primes. And number two, a lot of the time when people buy primes, they might end up buying 2 primes to do the job of 1 zoom. And therefore it probably stands to reason that there are more primes in the market than there are zooms, because zooms are designed to do the job of multiple primes. But I find this really interesting because the main advantage of primes, I would argue, has been diminished over the past few years because zooms have become so much better in terms of image quality. I mean, my 24-70 from Sony, the Mark II, is as good as any prime GM lens I've ever had in the real world in terms of image quality and sharpness. And I mean that, it's as good. Obviously it's not as bright, but if you were to look at a 35mm f1.4 and the 24-70, you're looking at images from both at a sensible aperture, you would be really pushed to spot the difference, particularly in the real world. And I mean, I love shooting primes. I prefer to shoot primes. I love the creative constraint. But it would be interesting to see if primes are as popular moving forward, given how good zooms seem to be, the modern zooms. Now, types of primes. Thought this was interesting as well. It stands to reason that over half of the primes were between 35mm and 50mm in focal length. And the second group, I think also stands to reason as well, just under 20%, they were 55mm to 105s. So majority of those were either 105s or 85s, kind of portrait primes. Makes a lot of sense. Big, big market. Just under 15% for both 24 and 28mm lenses, or lenses in between those focal lengths. And I should say these are all adjusted for equivalence, so for full frame focal lengths. And just under 10% for above 105. So there were a few 300mm primes, for instance, for wildlife. And some 135s too. Now, the breakdown for the 35mm to 50mm category I thought was interesting as well. 50mm is so much more popular than 35mm. I mean, by about 2 to 1, which I didn't necessarily expect. Now, I should say these numbers are probably warped by the fact that 50s seemed to be much more popular, again, in the film cameras, and there were lots of kits that looked like they had kind of a kit lens, kit zoom, that came with a camera, and then it looked like the next logical step for that person was a 50mm, a nifty 50, because they're so cheap, nice and bright, and it's a natural way to continue on with your photography, to pick a nice bright prime, to learn about depth of field, things like that. And 50s typically are a cheaper way to do that than 35s. Also, a little shout out to 40mm lenses. If you've followed this channel for a while, you'll know I'm a huge fan of 40mm, and I reckon this slice of the pie, currently at 13.5%, will grow as more 40mm lenses become available. And it does seem that more manufacturers are taking them seriously. I think they're fantastic, and I do expect this number to grow over time. Hopefully you're still awake. Just a couple more charts to go, I promise. Bag types. This seems a bit niche, and indeed I think I messed it up because I didn't necessarily specify that people should include their bags in the photo of their setup. And consequently, a third of people didn't include any sort of bag, either maybe because they don't use a bag or they just didn't think it was necessary. 2/3 did though, and of those 2/3, 61%, used some sort of shoulder bag. So a sling bag, a messenger bag, something that basically just goes over one shoulder as opposed to a backpack that goes over two. And to be honest, I think that speaks to the trend I was talking about earlier of people slimming down their kits a little bit. The last year or two, I've switched pretty much full time to shoulder bags. I only really use backpacks when I really need to, but I really try not to because I like to carry less weight. I like the creative constraint of having to really think about what it is that I'm taking with me. And frankly, they're just much easier to use. A backpack, I've found, regardless of the design, I end up having to put it on the floor to get anything out of it. And the last chart, drones. I didn't necessarily ask people to include drones if they had a drone, but I assume that most people would have. And on that basis, only 12.8% of people have a drone or included a photo of a drone in their photo or list. And I think this makes sense, to be honest. Again, if I was a landscape photographer, maybe the number of people with drones would be a little bit higher. But I think, and I've got no research to back this up, that drones might have had their day a little bit. Perhaps that's a bit of a controversial thing to say. But I think, based on what I see from other people's drone photos, it's increasingly difficult to get something unique and interesting with a drone, because typically you're flying quite high and therefore you're seeing a huge area with a wide angle lens that comes with most drones, and therefore most areas have been shot. That's not true. Lots of interesting areas have been photographed with drones now, and so getting something unique is probably quite difficult. And I guess on top of regulations and people slimming down their kits, as I was talking about, maybe that's the reason that, nearly 9 out of 10 people who watch my channel, according to this, don't use drones. And I don't use drones, to be honest. I can't remember the last time I took a drone photograph. I occasionally use my little DJI Mini, whatever it is, for a little bit of B-roll, but increasingly I don't take it. I can't be bothered. I've got a small little bag. There's no room for my drone in there. And so that concludes my research. And my wife, who's done a doctorate, would refuse to call that research, but I think it's quite interesting, regardless of how accurate it is. But yeah, hopefully that was interesting, and maybe I'll do a more in-depth version of this in future where I try and make it a little bit more accurate. Let me know if you'd find that interesting, or let me know if you wouldn't as well. Next week, hopefully we'll be back out and about taking photos. A huge thank you to those of you who sent in photos based on my newsletter. I really appreciate it. You can sign up for my newsletter down below in the description if you're interested in future versions. And also a huge thank you to those of you who pre-order my book. I really appreciate it. And finally, a big thank you to the sponsor of this week's video, Squarespace. Squarespace is what I use to put together my newsletters, which is super simple to do. You don't need to know a single line of code. It's also what I use for my online store, where I will sell my book, where I've always sold my presets, my prints, my other books that I've made, which compared to this new one are more like zines, to be honest. And Squarespace is also fantastic for hosting blogs, and particularly portfolios as far as us photographers are concerned. And in short, Squarespace is the most integral tool that I have for my business. Now, I couldn't run my business without it. So if you're a photographer, and I'm guessing you are, and you'd like to try out a website for yourself, then you can do so for free by going to squarespace.com to start a free trial. And after that, if you'd like to make a purchase, just go to squarespace.com/James and you'll get 10% off your first purchase. So a big thank you to Squarespace for their continued support. And yeah, I'll see you all next week when we won't be talking about data. I promise. I'll see you then.